Okay, so you want to own a medieval watermill. You have a timber building beside a reliable stream, a turning wheel, a pair of heavy millstones, and a line of tenants arriving with sacks of wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Every harvest creates more grain. Nearly every household needs that grain ground. And each time the stones turn, you take a portion as payment. That is the dream. The problem is that you may not own the stream. You may not control the tenants. You may not even operate the mill yourself. One dry summer can stop the wheel. One flood can tear apart the weir. One cracked millstone can halt production, and if the villagers decide your toll is unfair, your supposedly dependable income may become a legal battle fought in the manorial court. Yet in medieval England, a mill could still be more valuable than another stretch of farmland. Farmland produced one harvest from one piece of soil. A compulsory manorial mill could take a share from harvests grown across an entire community. That was the real business. Our setting is England from the Domesday survey of 1086 to about 1300, when Norman and Plantagenet kings ruled through a layered system of royal authority, baronial lordship, ecclesiastical estates, manors, customary tenancies, and local courts. This was not a modern property market. You did not simply find a stream, borrow money, build a wheel, and open for business. Control usually came through lordship. The king granted land to tenants-in-chief. Great lords divided control among lesser lords. Bishops, abbeys, and priories held extensive estates. Within each manor, rights over land, water, roads, woodland, courts, labor, and rents could belong to different people under different customs. A mill was often treated as part of the manor's productive equipment, like a bakehouse, fish pond, woodland, or Domesday farm, but with one crucial advantage. It could process grain grown on land that the mill owner did not cultivate. Domesday Book shows just how important mills already were. The survey ordered by William the Conqueror recorded more than 6,000 mills across England, overwhelmingly water-powered. That was roughly 1 mill for every 2 settlements recorded in the survey, though the distribution varied by region and the record was not perfectly complete. This number matters because a medieval watermill was not a rare experiment. It was a mature piece of infrastructure, embedded in rural life before the Norman conquest, and then absorbed into the new structure of Norman lordship. Domesday commissioners were interested in what estates contained and what they were worth. Mills appear beside plowlands, meadows, woodland, fisheries, saltworks, livestock, and households. Some were assigned only a few shillings of annual value. Others contributed to much larger manorial totals. Was not the same as modern net profit. It might represent expected annual income, render, or the value a lord could extract from the estate. It does not hand us a clean medieval income statement. Still, the repeated appearance of mills tells us something important. Lords wanted them counted because mills produced revenue. To become the true owner of one, you usually needed to be born, married, appointed, or granted into the correct level of society. A baron might receive a manor from the king. A monastery might acquire a mill through donation, exchange, purchase, or the development of its own estate. A lesser lord could inherit one. In some places, a town, religious house, or wealthy landholder might control several. For most people, however, the realistic route was not ownership. A miller might hold the mill as a tenant, paying an agreed rent to the lord. He might receive wages and operate it directly for the estate. He might take responsibility for ordinary upkeep, while the lord remained responsible for major structural repairs. The exact arrangement could vary enormously, and that difference determined who carried the risk. If you lease the mill for a fixed annual rent, a good harvest can be excellent. More grain passes through your stones, more toll is collected, and the lord's rent remains the same. But in a poor harvest, the landlord still expects payment. If drought stops the wheel, the rent does not automatically disappear. If tenants secretly grind elsewhere, you lose revenue before your own obligations fall due. Owning the legal privilege was safer than leasing the machine. Before any grain could be ground, someone had to make an enormous capital commitment. The visible building was only one part of it. You needed access to moving water, a defensible right to divert it, and enough fall in the landscape to create useful power. You might need a weir to raise the water level, a mill pond to store flow, a leat or artificial channel to carry water toward the wheel, sluice gates to regulate it, and a tail race to return it downstream. Then came the machinery. A vertical water wheel turned an axle. Gearing transferred that rotation into the mill. One millstone remained fixed while another revolved above it. Grain entered through a hopper, fell between the stones and emerged as meal or flour depending on the grain, the spacing of the stones, and the skill of the miller. Every part wore down. Timber rotted. Iron fittings loosened. Teeth broke from wooden gears. Silt accumulated in channels. Banks collapsed. The wheel suffered from water, ice, debris, and constant movement. Millstones became smooth and had to be dressed, cut again with grooves that allowed them to grind efficiently. A badly dressed stone could heat the meal, reduce quality, waste grain, or slow the work. The stones themselves were expensive, heavy, and difficult to transport. Medieval mills depended on networks of quarrymen, merchants, boatmen, wagoners, carpenters, smiths, and specialist millwrights. Later medieval records show stones moving across regions and even arriving from continental Europe. Some weighed close to a ton. The mill looked local, but its supply chain could stretch far beyond the village. This is why location mattered more than the building. A strong stream in the wrong place was useless if grain could not reach it. The mill needed road access for carts and pack animals. It needed nearby customers, secure banks, and water rights that would survive disputes. A site too low might flood. A site too high might lack sufficient flow. A mill placed downstream from another water user might receive less power. A new dam could drown a neighbor's meadow or interfere with fishing. The mill owner therefore needed two kinds of control: physical control over water and social control over customers. The payment collected by the mill was commonly called multure. In plain English, the miller kept a portion of the grain as the fee for grinding it. Sometimes obligations could be expressed or settled in money, especially as the English economy became increasingly monetized. But payment in kind had an obvious advantage. Grain was the product being processed, so the mill could collect its fee immediately from each sack. That removed one problem modern businesses know well: customers who promised to pay later. It created another problem. Grain was not coin. The owner or miller had to store it, protect it from damp, rodents, theft, and spoilage, and then consume it, sell it, or use it to meet other obligations. A mill could appear rich while lacking ready cash. Its booms might be full, while its roof repair, rent, or hired carpenter had to be paid in silver. The most powerful revenue advantage was suit of mill. Suit of mill was a customary or legal obligation requiring certain tenants to bring their grain to a particular lord's mill. In some places, tenants could be prohibited from using hand mills, horse mills, or neighboring water mills. The lord's mill then possessed something close to a protected local market. But we should not imagine one universal rule imposed identically across England. Milling customs differed by manor, tenant status, local agreement, and time. Claims were disputed. Some obligations covered only particular tenants or particular grain. Some people escaped them through exemptions. Others challenged the mill because it was too slow, badly maintained, or unable to serve them. Even so, where the right was enforceable, its economic value was extraordinary. Suppose you own 10 more acres of farmland. You must provide seed, labor, plow animals, tools, and perhaps food for workers. You carry the direct risk of weather and crop failure. Your return depends on what those 10 acres produce. Now suppose you control the manorial mill, and 100 households owe suit to it. Those households provide their own land, seed, labor, and animals. They absorb the costs of cultivation. When their grain reaches your mill, you take a fraction. You are not earning from one field. You are placing a toll gate between the harvest and the loaf. This does not eliminate agricultural risk. A bad harvest means less grain to grind. But it spreads your claim across many holdings. One tenant's poor field may be balanced by another tenant's better crop. The mill converts a local necessity into a recurring stream of toll income. And the demand is unusually dependable because grain cannot easily become bread, ale, porridge, or marketable meal without processing. Hand grinding was possible and remained important in some places, but it consumed time and labor. A watermill could process much larger quantities. By around 1300, England may have had roughly 10,000 watermills and windmills, and powered mills probably handled most of the country's grain. At full strength, a single pair of stones could grind substantial quantities in a day, but average output depended on water, maintenance, customer traffic, and the type of grain. The mill was not operating continuously at a modern factory rate. It followed the rhythm of harvests, market days, household need, brewing, baking, rainfall, and daylight. The miller's skill mattered because customers watched their grain closely. A miller had opportunities to cheat. He controlled the measure, handled the grain, collected the toll, and returned a processed product that could be difficult for an ordinary customer to evaluate precisely. Medieval literature often portrayed millers as dishonest for a reason. The business contained an information imbalance. Reputation was part of the machinery. If tenants believed the miller took too much mixed grain, produced poor meal, or delayed their sacks while favoring wealthier customers, resentment grew. They might hide hand mills, travel to a competing mill, refuse the customary obligation, complain in court, or pressure the lord. A miller protected by suit of mill still needed the legal system to enforce that protection, and every enforcement action carried social and administrative costs. Daily operation required more than one man standing beside a wheel. Grain had to be received, identified, measured, tewed, ground, bagged, and returned. The machinery needed lubrication. Channels had to be cleared. Sluices had to be adjusted as the water rose or fell. Millstones had to be dressed. Repairs required carpenters, smiths, masons, diggers, carters, and specialist millwrights. The miller's household could supply part of the labor. Servants or hired workers might help. On manorial estates, some work could be demanded through customary labor services, though the extent and burden varied widely. A monastery could draw on estate officers, tenants, hired specialists, transport networks, and stored resources across several properties. This gave large institutional owners a major advantage. A small lord with one mill depended on one stream and one group of tenants. A wealthy abbey or great estate could own several mills, purchase materials in larger quantities, move grain between properties, hire experienced officials, and absorb one repair without losing all milling revenue. Monastic mills also reveal that the mill was part of a wider water management system. At Fountains Abbey, for example, the river Skell was redirected through an engineered network that supplied water, drainage, and power. Its early 13th century corn mill stood beside other economic buildings. Water did not serve only one wheel. It organized an entire institutional landscape. That scale was difficult to imitate. A monastery could wait years for an investment to repay itself because the mill supported the abbey's food supply, estate income, tenants, and other activities. A private mill tenant paying annual rent had much less patience. Here's the trap the ownership dream leaves out. The legal monopoly was valuable only while the physical service worked. A lord could claim that tenants owed suit of mill. But if the wheel was broken, the channel blocked, or the queue impossible, people still needed flour. A right that prevented customers from going elsewhere became harder to defend when the owner failed to maintain the mill. Later disputes from Bovey Tracy in Devon show this mechanism with unusual clarity. The watermills there occupied a site associated with milling since before Domesday. In later centuries, owners claimed that inhabitants of the manor, parish, and borough owed suit of mill and had to grind grain grown or consumed in their households at the customary mills. Competing mills, household grinding, and customers carrying grain elsewhere threatened the toll income. Yet the monopoly came with an obligation. Later legal evidence indicates that if the manorial mill could not serve customers because it was out of repair or overwhelmed, they could be allowed to go elsewhere after a limited waiting period. The Bovey Tracy disputes are later than our core period, so they cannot be copied backward, as though every rule existed unchanged in 1100. But they preserve the economic logic of customary milling with remarkable clarity. The owner wanted guaranteed custom. The customer expected a functioning service. The miller stood between them, paying rent on one side and trying to collect toll on the other. That is why a broken wheel could create three simultaneous crises. First, revenue stopped immediately. Second, repair costs arrived at the same moment. Third, customers discovered alternatives. A flood was even worse. It could destroy the weir, damage the building, scatter timber, silt the channel, and alter the river itself. A drought produced the opposite problem. The mill remained standing, but could not generate enough power. Severe winter weather could freeze water or damage structures. War could lead to requisition of grain, timber, carts, animals, or labor. A local dispute could close access to the stream. A damaged bridge could prevent customers from reaching the site. Some costs continued through every crisis. Rent might still be due. Workers still needed food or wages. The millstones and building remained valuable but idle. Grain already taken as toll could spoil. The lord might insist on repairs because the mill supported the wider manor. An inexperienced operator could therefore confuse throughput with profit. A busy mill looked wealthy because sacks arrived constantly. But each sack represented measurement, labor, wear, storage, customer risk, and a small toll rather than ownership of the whole contents. The landlord's economics were different. If the mill was leased, the lord exchanged some upside for a more predictable rent. The tenant miller handled daily operations and much of the customer conflict. If the mill was directly managed, the lord kept more revenue, but also paid wages, supervised accounts, purchased supplies, and carried operating risk. This division explains why the person called the mill owner might not be the person earning from each sack. The lord owned the privilege and the structure. The miller controlled the daily flow. A monastery or a state officer controlled accounts. Tenants supplied the grain. Craftsmen preserved the machinery. The business was a chain of claims, not a single proprietor behind a counter. At the smallest scale, an isolated mill serving a few households could be fragile. Revenue might not justify major repairs, and one competing handmill could matter. At the manorial scale, a well-placed mill with enforceable suit could provide reliable income because it drew from a broad agricultural base. At the institutional scale, a monastery or great lord could integrate several mills into a larger estate economy and treat water power as infrastructure rather than a standalone trade. The economics improved with scale, but so did political visibility. Valuable rights invited disputes. Water crossed property boundaries. Tenants resisted tolls. Neighboring lords defended their own mills. Royal and local courts became part of the cost structure. By 1300, the basic model had already begun to diversify. Windmills expanded milling into places where streams were weak or already controlled. Urban mills could specialize in grain for baking or brewing. Water power increasingly served industrial work, such as fulling cloth, operating bellows, or driving hammers. The same principle, converting a natural flow into controlled mechanical power, spread beyond flour. In later centuries, population change, new tenancy arrangements, competing mills, altered legal customs, and more commercial forms of leasing weakened or reshaped some manorial monopolies. Yet suit of mill survived in certain places for a very long time because the right could be more durable than the original medieval building. So, was owning a medieval watermill worth it? For an ordinary peasant with no water rights, no capital, and no manorial privilege, true ownership was usually unrealistic. Becoming a miller or leasing a mill was possible, but it placed you in the most dangerous position, responsible for rent, customers, machinery, and daily operation without necessarily controlling the legal foundations of the business. For a lord, bishop, abbey, or well-protected landholder, the mill could be an excellent asset. The largest barrier was not the wheel. It was obtaining the right site, the water, the capital, and the authority to direct custom toward the mill. The largest recurring cost was maintenance. The most important revenue stream was the toll on grain. The greatest threat was the simultaneous loss of water power, customer obedience, and legal protection. And this answers the central question. Why could compulsory milling rights be more valuable than additional farmland? Because farmland gave you the output of the land you worked or rented. A manorial mill gave you a claim on the output of land worked by everyone else. You were buying a legally defended position inside the village food system, a place where grain had to pass, where toll could be collected before flour reached the oven, and where control of one stream could turn an ordinary wooden wheel into one of the most dependable revenue machines in medieval England. That was the old economics of the watermill. The wheel created the power, the manor created the customers, and the privilege created the profit.